Hello there, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter podcast. I am really excited to share with you today's episode. My guest today is John Seed. John is a professor of art and art history. His specialties include contemporary representational art, Bay Area figurative art, and 19th and 20th century South Asian and Hawaiian art. In this episode, John describes his formative experience in a monotype class with Nathan Oliveira at Stanford University. John and I talk about his experiences working in galleries and handling art at the Gagosian gallery. He describes what it was like hanging paintings by renowned artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat and Eric Fischl. Since 2010, John has been writing about art on the Huffington Post. His articles have also appeared in hyperallergic.com, and he has curated issues of Poets and Artists. John and I discuss the evolution of John the painter to John the writer and art teacher, plus how artists might learn to share their own stories. So without further ado, here is John Seed. John, welcome to the Savvy Painter podcast, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I'm really excited to have you on.
Oh, thank you, Antrice.
Can you talk a little bit about your early exposure to Bay Area figurative painting when you were in college?
Absolutely. I got to college not especially knowing what I wanted to do with my life. And I certainly had lots of adults rooting for me, maybe telling me what I should be doing. But I'd been a creative kid who worked on model airplanes, did puppetry, made cartoons. But it just never occurred to me that I was going to go into the art field. That didn't seem to be something that anyone I knew actually did. And what happened to me is my second semester, I took a printmaking class. I took a monotype class with Nathan Oliveira. And Stanford University was probably the only school in the United States that had a dedicated monotype class. It was something that Nathan specialized in and had been doing for a few years. And listening to one of his slide lectures, watching him show a series of monotypes, I had that moment, which if you've been really fortunate in life, you've had this kind of moment where you just saw a door open. I listened to Nathan and I thought, I'm interested in his art. I'm interested in the way he talks. I'm interested in his thinking. I just was absolutely mesmerized by what he was doing, what he was saying. And I went home and told my parents, I've got the best news. Greatest thing has happened. I've got a major. I'm going to be an art major. And of course, the room went silent for about 2 more years.
Really?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. So your parents were not enthused about this choice of yours?
Well, being a parent myself now and putting it in perspective, when your child is making a future decision that's going to affect where they can live and what can they afford and will they be able to take care of themselves, it's a pretty serious thing. And I think my parents were genuinely concerned, why would I do this thing that was so impractical, that just seemed so uncertain? But I really had, without anticipating it, without knowing what was going to happen, I had found what I really had to do. It was almost like finding my tribe. I know an artist that I have interviewed that I love her work and I love what she says. There's a wonderful painter named Staver, who when I interviewed her told me a story about being in high school and having a high school teacher come to her one day and say, I know what's wrong with you. You're an artist.
I know what's wrong with you.
Yeah, I know what's wrong with you. And again, this experience of hearing a mature artist talk about a sequence of his work and realizing that I'd found a way of thinking that was going to serve me the rest of my life, it was that same kind of feeling of now I fit or I know where I belong.
And how did that shape you in a sense? Like, I'm kind of curious what, you said that it took your parents 2 years that, there was that silence for 2 years. Do you think they were just hoping you would get over it?
Well, I came from a family that had accomplishment, and my grandfather had been a very, very well-regarded attorney who became a judge in Los Angeles Superior Court. And I think my mother looked and thought, well, we may have an attorney here. I reminded people of my grandfather. So there was a lot of expectation going on.
Was it scary for you then to do that? Did you ever doubt what you were doing?
No, I think I was pretty innocent and being innocent served me very, very well. Like so many things in life, if someone had told me what I really would face and what the difficulties were, maybe I would have had a second thought. But I was just excited. For the first time, well, to back up a little bit, one of the things that I started doing in that class is the doors were open through the afternoon and sometimes into the evening at the art studios. I just started hanging out there. It became my obsession, spending all my time drawing on the monoprint plate, pressing monoprints, seeing what I got, and then doing another variation. So I had gone through high school with people telling me, well, John, you're very bright. You should be able to get good grades, but always kind of nudging me, like so many people be nudged when they're younger. And all of a sudden I was launched. I needed no more nudging. I really, really wanted to do this thing. And an interesting thing that happened, a byproduct, is once I discovered art and declared my major, I did better in all my other classes because I knew why I was in school. I was suddenly really craving an education in every way, and I was loving what I was doing, and I started to mature on my own terms.
Very cool. Interesting. I think it's so interesting how once you're finally comfortable in your own skin, then everything else just opens up. It affects everything.
We all need people to look up to. And I know in a couple of your podcasts, you've talked to people about their mentors. But, at a school like Stanford, the great majority of the students were doing the kinds of things you'd expect. The MBA was a kind of a new degree. A lot of people were talking about going to business school. I certainly had, friends that were going to go and be attorneys and doctors and professional people. And in a way, that really, really worked to my advantage. I would find out when Nathan had his office hours, and I'd be the one kid sitting there on the bench when he turned the key in the door.
Oh, wow.
Almost like stalking.
Oh, I've done that with some of my instructors.
I just thought, this instructor, I want to learn from this instructor. And he was so gracious because he saw what I was about and he saw what I was interested in. My parents actually came up to visit. And they were concerned about my choice of major. We were starting to talk about it. And he took them in his office for half an hour. And I never really asked them or asked him what they talked about. But they came out of that half-hour meeting at least calmed down. At least
nice.
Feeling, okay, maybe we should let our son go ahead and do this. So he kind of was an intermediary for me. And then the opportunities began to come. He introduced me to some famous collectors, to Hunk and Moo Anderson, who just recently opened a museum on the Stanford campus. And I became an intern who gave people tours of their collection and of their home. And that led to, huge exposure to all kinds of art, but including Bay Area figurative art, including the people that had been the previous generation to Nathan and to Nathan's peers. So that opened the field up more broadly to me.
Fascinating. And what were some of your takeaways from studying with Nathan? What do you, looking back, what are some of the things that still just kind of ring in your ears?
I think as an artist, the one thing that was his big message, his big lesson was gesture. In drawing and in painting, he saw it as your body and your mind being connected. And he had something he said to people, which at first I almost would giggle at it. I didn't know how to take it, but he would say that there was an energy that came through his mind, through his arm, through his hand, through the brush, and into the work of art. And it was a little bit supernatural, to say that. But then you would see him work and you would see how graceful his figures were and how energetic and alive they were. And I began to respect that idea that through your physical body, there was a romantic spark. There was an energy that came from that. And then I think the other thing, which was even more important, was that I had an example of a fully engaged artist as a human being. And he was a teacher. And so I realized that maybe teaching would be what I would want to do. And I liked the way he treated people. I liked the way he was a member of his community. And I really just had an image of this is a way of living and a way of thinking that has so much to show me.
It sounds like it was an amazing experience to be able to study with him. And I love that you were just sitting there outside of his office waiting for him. I just have this image in my head of this kid just young John ready for instruction.
It's a great image. And even now, I mean, to be a little bit sappy about it, I'm sitting in my office. I'm a college professor, and I have a picture of Nathan up, high on the wall, along with all my other pictures. And there is this feeling of paying it forward, of, admiring what someone did and then finding a way to carry that forward, some of that gracefulness and some of his ideas. And talking about ideas, you brought up Bay Area figuration. One of the things that came from being an art student in the Bay Area, as opposed to, say, studying in New York, is this idea that the human figure was a viable vehicle for modern art.
Right.
And also in the Bay Area, someone who's still around, was a, kind of an influence through Nathan, a friend of Nathan's, was the art historian Peter Sells, who says that art has many faces. And I love that. I love that breadth. Going to school in the Bay Area, I certainly saw compelling abstract art. Mm-hmm. I saw compelling representational art. And I saw all of those traditions being very, very vital and very, very respected. And that was key for me.
Can you put this into context for people? What year was that? And who were some of the figurative artists who were working at that time?
Well, I was at Stanford from 1975 to 1977. And in our department, to give you an idea, there was a veteran abstract artist named Frank Lobdell. Mm-hmm. He did very, very kind of strong, craggy, almost expressionistic abstract paintings. But one figure that was very, influential for the whole Stanford campus was Richard Diebenkorn. He had been there as a visiting artist in the 1960s, and he came to make monotypes in 1975. And one of the things that Nathan did for his students, which it takes my breath away when I think back, he would introduce us. And he gave me Richard Diebenkorn's phone number and said, when you're home in Los Angeles, when you're home for break, you should call him and meet him. And I did. I spent an afternoon with Richard Diebenkorn. And, at the time, I knew that this was a privilege. I knew that this was a special thing. But now from, 35 years later, I look back and I think, my God, what a wonderful opportunity for a teacher to say, let me introduce you to someone like this and to give you that firsthand.
I can't even imagine. That's incredible. You don't happen to know Bud Flagg, do you? Or Morgan Flagg?
No, I don't think I do.
Okay.
I know the name, but not the person.
Okay. I was just curious. He's one of my friend's grandfathers, and he was a big collector of the Bay Area figurative artists. And
that's where I've seen that name in connection with a collection. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, that does connect.
Yeah, I had a great honor to meet him, and my friend, we'd known each other for a long time, but he said, I think you should meet my grandfather. And so he invited me over to his house, and he was showing me his collection, and there was just Diebenkorns and Parks and all these sketches and drawings and, like Wayne Thiebaud and sketches on napkins. It was, kind of, hey, bud, thanks for lunch and all this stuff. And, I was walking through that and I'm just like, almost stopped breathing, that feeling where you're just like, oh my God, it was just incredible. And he had these works on every available space, literally. Like there was a spare bedroom and that wasn't used often. And so on the back of the bathroom door, there was this just amazing drawing. And I'm walking through this just going, I can't even believe what I'm seeing. And he's apologizing to me that he just donated the good stuff, according to him. And I was just like, I can't even really articulate what that meant to me to be able to see that. So I can't even imagine getting on the phone with Diebenkorn.
Oh no, I went to his home.
You're killing me, John.
No, I went to his home and spent an afternoon, and without going off on too much of a tangent, he was just very gracious. We sat down and he wanted to talk about art because that's what he did with visitors and with friends. And he kind of took me through a sequence. We started, there was a Rothko retrospective going on. So we talked about Rothko, and I showed him some of my drawings, which he was, very diplomatic about. Those are drawings, look at those. But then eventually he started to talk about some more obscure artists. And at a certain point, he lost me. I remember he was talking to me about an artist from the East Coast. Carl Ness was the name of the artist. And I looked at him, and I looked at him kind of blankly. And I realized that in a nice way, the conversation was over. It took a couple of hours to get there. But, had a wonderful afternoon with him. And the embarrassing thing is, as I was leaving, he came to the gate with his dog, and he said, "You really need to come by the studio sometime. Just let me know next time you're back in LA. Please come and see what I'm painting." And at that point, I was so humbled and maybe just young and immature. I never called back. I never took up that opportunity. And of course, I regret that.
Right. Yeah. Actually, in a weird way, that's kind of how I started the podcast, was because I was, it was very similar, that I was just too shy, I think. And right now, it just seems so absurd and crazy. But at the time, what I was thinking was, I don't want to bother him with all of my questions. And of course, all of my questions are about the thing that he loves the most. So I know, it's so silly.
There's a great fantasy maybe about going back with more confidence. And talking about shyness, that kind of helps me respond to what you were saying about visiting the flag collection. Mm-hmm. I spent a great deal of time at the Anderson collection and had that same kind of, experience of people who were very, very familiar with living with a high level of art every day. And they had two collections. They had a corporate collection at Saga Foods headquarters, where most of the tours took place. But they also had people over to their home. And going with that idea of shyness, one day I was at the Andersons' home, and they had just bought a late Philip Guston painting called The Coat, which of course is still part of their collection, and now it's part of their museum. And I loved this painting. I mean, it still smelled wet. You could still smell the linseed oil. And I was just hovering around this painting. And Dr. Albert Elson was a very, very intimidating art history instructor. He was a Rodin expert, world-known art historian, came by and saw me looking at this painting and said, "What do you like about it?" And I was absolutely tongue-tied. I was terrified. I had nothing to say. I don't even remember what I babbled. But looking back on that, I think that one of the reasons I later became an art writer, and we're talking, 10 or 20 years later, is the embarrassment over not being able to say to Dr. Elson, "Here's why I like that, and here's what I see in it." It was a long, slow road to trying to find a way to articulate that and get past the shyness and speak my own mind.
I'm really interested in this. This is fascinating to me, because I feel like I had that similar path to starting this podcast. Can you tell me, during those 10 years before you started really writing about art, what was going on? Were you trying to figure it out on your own and not publishing it? Or what was happening? What was sort of the pivotal point when you decided that you were going to start writing about art?
Well, there's a lot of fill-in. After Stanford, I worked for a year or two, and then I attended graduate school at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And by the way, after I listened to Phyllis Schaefer's podcast, I sent her a fan email because I liked her and I liked hearing from her. And I also had some complaints about UC Berkeley. I didn't have a great experience there. But what I wanted to say is that also gave me contact with a few other Bay Area painters. I took a class with Joan Brown. I studied with Elmer Bischoff. Wow. And I got a glimpse of what they were like as people and what they were about. But to kind of shorten the story, after all of that happened, after I got my graduate degree, I went back to Los Angeles, and I guess I was kind of a well-educated failure to launch. I moved back to my parents' house, and they kind of were looking at me in a nice way. "Well, okay, John, you did that.
What's next?"
You got to the art field. What are you going to do now? Uh-huh. And I had a Toyota pickup truck. I had a used Toyota pickup truck. And I started driving around town. And as fate would have it, I drove to the Larry Gagosian gallery, Larry being a new young dealer in Los Angeles. And I pulled up and said, "Do you need someone to deliver paintings?" And he kind of looked me up and down and said, "Sure."
Wow.
So my next art world immersion was about 6 months. And I'm surprised I lasted 6 months. But I worked for Larry Gagosian, who was just then kind of it wasn't going to say he was riding the crest of the wave of the 80s, but he was making the 80s art scene happen. He was bringing New York talents to the West Coast and showing their work. So through him, I met and hung exhibitions of people like Eric Fischl and David Sally and Jean-Michel Basquiat. Ended up kind of being the source of a lot of my stories. You know, when people buy me a beer, they say, tell me a Basquiat story, because I made canvases for Jean-Michel Basquiat. And that was just an eye popper in every way.
Okay, you're going to have to tell me a Basquiat story, but I'm kind of curious because you almost make it sound like you stumble into the right place at the right time. Is that true?
Yes. In fact, if I had to think of kind of a way to describe my life, maybe in one image, I used to love that. I forget the name of the movie. Maybe it was The Great Race, but it was a movie with Tony Curtis where there's a pie fight scene, and there's this huge pie fight scene, and everybody's throwing pies, and Tony Curtis is wearing a white suit, and no pies hit him until maybe the very, very end. But I had that quality of going through life, and the pies kept not hitting me. I just kind of kept going in the right situation, and I always was left standing up, and I kept meeting people. I was a nice young man, and when you say Stanford to people, that's a door opener. And generally for non-creepy reasons, and sometimes for creepy reasons, people took an interest in me and introduced me to other people, and just kept bringing me into these situations.
And you did nothing to facilitate that.
Well, I was smart, and I was interested. I had that naivete I was talking about of, hey, I want to explore this. And I have to tell you, thinking about my background, having met and worked with Nathan Oliveira and the Andersons, I had the view that people in the art world were the most generous, kind, human, and grateful people in the world. So then to fall into Gagosian Gallery, which, without giving too many details, it was like suddenly being in a Charles Dickens book and learning to pick pockets. I was in this kind of like criminal enterprise. It was like a huge shock, and I had to grow up really, really fast because I was in the fast lane, and it wasn't anything like my previous experience of the art world.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah. Here's a story, because again, I have another reason I think I became a writer is I have these great stories. There was maybe a doctor, I've forgotten exactly who he was, but there was a guy that had a Russian modernist piece of art. I forget if it was a Malevich or something, but a very, very precious piece of Russian art, who had a financial emergency. And he was one of Larry's clients. And he came in one day kind of sweating and nervous and carrying this package. And he said, I've got to have a lot of money. I've got to sell this. Larry, what can you do? Can you get me cash?
Oh, wow. Larry
said, yeah, there's a dealer up in the Bay Area that might want this. John, here you go. And he handed me the painting. And I got on Southwest and went up and showed this, to this dealer. And by the way, the dealer didn't take it.
Uh-huh.
And so I came back to Los Angeles, and through the rest of the evening, Larry had gone home, but we were getting phone calls at the gallery from this collector who I think was getting drunker and drunker, just calling, did you sell it? Do you have cash?
It's been 20 minutes. Come on.
And I had, brought it back on Southwest. And I had a similar thing where Larry had me show a painting to a famous collector from Switzerland at the Beverly Hills Hotel. And I remember, running through the lobby of the Beverly Hills Hotel and almost bumping into Elizabeth Taylor, and then going to this bungalow and showing this collector this, work, which he also didn't buy. But I was just doing these kind of crazy errands and watching this fast-moving world of prices I couldn't imagine and extraordinary people and great art, and all of it in kind of a blur, all of it moving as fast as it possibly could.
Yeah, I imagine, like, on the one hand, I'm just kind of imagining you as this sort of young kid with these extremely expensive paintings and running all over California with them. But I'm also curious about how that experience changed your view of the art world, or did it?
It showed me who I didn't want to be. Because what I tell people about Basquiat, people say, tell me your stories and what was it like to know him? And I tell people two things. I say that it was exciting to really encounter a genius and to be around that spark. but it was also extremely sad.
Uh-huh.
Because you could feel kind of the pressure around him, and you could see the drug abuse, and you could see just kind of the craziness of it all.
Right.
So I think that whole experience of being in the fast lane was good for me. I mean, it clarified for me who I wasn't. One other thing, and I haven't thought about this in years, but one other memory that comes to me, there was a woman dealer from New York who stole a Basquiat while I was in the gallery. And Larry was not there, but, he told me, would you take her over to the other gallery and show her these things in the back room? And there was a gallery with a display room and also a back room. And this woman went into the back room while I was out in the front. And then later, Larry came back and a Basquiat drawing had just been taken out of a frame.
Whoa.
And Larry looked at me, and I think for about 5 seconds, he thought John stole it. And then his face changed. And you could see, I don't know if he said to me, but he just, John wouldn't steal. He knew it wasn't me,
Right.
which was great. But that was kind of how I felt in that situation. It clarified that I wasn't meant for that. I wasn't in the fast lane. But wow, did I meet some interesting people and have some great glimpses of art and private collections, and just gather a lot of information for my future and for writing.
How did you, there's so much to talk about, John. I'm trying to contain myself right now. But just getting back to I think we could probably do like a whole show on Basquiat stories and stories of working at that gallery. I'm imagining.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious how you pulled all that into your writing. How did you go from there into deciding that you wanted to write about art? Because you write a ton.
I became a community college art instructor. After working for Larry, I worked for the Museum of Contemporary Art when it was new. And let's just say there's a show there and there's some stories there. But the short version is that I was the bookstore manager at MoCA. And lots more exposure, a lot more stories, all these things added up. But what I really, really wanted to do was I wanted to teach. That model of Nathan Oliveira had stayed with me. So 31 years ago, I did, and this is why I related to Phyllis Schaefer so well. I drove to my interview at Mount San Jacinto College, about 90 minutes from Los Angeles, and got a full-time teaching job. And I'm just now finishing my 31st year of teaching. And community college became my way of paying the bills in a regular way, of finding my role as a teacher, finding my place in a community, and slowing down a little bit, letting myself grow in a new way and in new directions. And the main thing that happened here, because it's a small college, at the final interview, they said to me, well, your degree is you're a painter, you're a studio artist, but can you also teach art history? And I said, of course. Which I really couldn't, but I said, of course, because it's the final interview. And I taught art history with a textbook on my bedside table, and I was pretty weak for the first year or two. But after 2 or 3 years, it started to take, and at about the 5-year point, teaching art history became my favorite thing and maybe the thing that I did best. And having to talk about art and having to explain art to a wide community college audience, I think that was where John the Explainer was born. The person that could take a work of art and break it down and talk about it and put it in context. And that was the development. 10 years of doing that brought me right to the edge of, being able to write. That's where the skills really came from.
Interesting. I'm curious, at those early stages when you had the books beside your bed, it sounds like you were completely winging it. Is that true?
Well, yes and no, because I had this really rich exposure. I had this precious, was firsthand exposure to art and artists. But I had taken, in college, the same survey art history courses that you took. Mm-hmm. Jansen was the textbook, and we took the 101, the ancient Paleolithic to medieval, and then medieval to the 19th century.
Yep, I still have that book.
Right. Everybody takes the 2-part survey. So I was just like everyone else. I had taken that class, but I was not a trained art historian and didn't have a degree in art history. So I had that introduction, but really I had to become self-educated after that.
Yeah. And that's what I'm kind of curious about, because I didn't mean that to sound like, like, oh, you didn't know what you're talking about, John. But there's a point where, coming from, I don't know, like the probably very similar art history classes, because we had the exact same textbook. I'm curious, or maybe I'm just projecting my experience to you, but I remember coming out of college and then getting exposed to people, sounds like similar to you did, where you have this realization that you really have no idea about anything, or, that there's a lot of artists that you don't know anything about. So I'm kind of curious for yourself, for you, when you sort of realized that you could teach art history and you did know what you were talking about and you did have something to say.
Well, I had come to this college and I told my friends, because I'm missing Los Angeles. I was missing my city life. I said, well, I have a 5-year plan. I'm going to go to this college and I'll teach there for 5 years. And then I'll think about what do I want to do next. And of course, 5 years turned into 31 because you become your job.
Yeah.
You grow into these things. But there was a moment, asking about a moment. I think after 5 years, I felt confident teaching. But there was a moment where I suddenly realized that the teaching and the interest could turn into writing. And there's a good story about that.
I'd love to hear it.
The story goes, I was in a thrift shop in Dana Point. And like a lot of art people, I sometimes look for paintings, and it's usually 99% junk,
Mm-hmm.
But I bought a painting for $150 that was a Philippine painting. And I just thought it was kind of a fine painting. And I think this was just when eBay was new. I put it on eBay and I sold it. I think I made $50. I think I got $200 for it or something. But the man who bought it turned out to be a very sophisticated private dealer who dealt in Asian and Philippine and Hawaiian art, who, by the way, is still a good friend of mine. 20 years later, we're still
No kidding. Somebody you met on eBay?
Met him on eBay. And as he got to know me and realized I was a college professor, we were trading email. He said, look, I'm mailing you $1,000. And what I want you to do with this $1,000 is I want you to write an article about an artist who we all know here in Hawaii that has an uncertain history. We really don't know much about him because he committed suicide when he was young, when he was, I think, 27 when he committed suicide. And I want you to see if you could write an article and do research about this artist. And what happened there was I thought, well, $1,000, that's a lot of money. I'm going to spend a month on this. I spent 1.5 years.
Wow.
And I uncovered the story of this man's life and found out he was a survivor of the Armenian genocide. I found his family, his descendants in Europe, made all these discoveries about him, and published an article in Honolulu magazine. And it was the first thing I had ever published. And at the same time, around that same time, just after it was published, I came down with cancer. I had testicular cancer, and I had a big health emergency dealing with cancer, and I went through chemotherapy.
Wow.
And as I was coming through chemotherapy, I got a phone call. And it was the editor of that magazine. He said, congratulations, you've won a Society of Professional Journalists Award for the best art article published in Hawaii this year.
Wow.
And that aided my recovery a lot because I was just coming through chemo and my health was in poor shape. But here was this, breakthrough of, guess what, John? Not only can you write, but you write well.
Really well. That's a very prestigious award.
It came out of nowhere, and it also, to kind of talk about how things happened, all the years I had been teaching, my painting had only been so-so. I was doing some painting on the side, but I didn't have a lot of time for it. And my painting had kind of been on the decline, and it hit me, particularly because I know some people that, I guess the way I say it is, I know some people who are A painters, who are tremendously talented, who I really, really look up to. And I had this kind of epiphany. And it goes, John, you're a B painter. If you had all the time in the world and all the studio space and all the paints, you'd be a B painter. But you may be an A writer. And so I switched.
Interesting.
I switched. And of course, painting and my background in being a painter, being an artist, it gave me my subject. And what every artist needs is what every writer needs is they need the right subject. And I now had experience. I had explained things to people as a teacher. I had memories and stories about art and about artists. And I had found that I had a talent for writing. And the next chapter started there.
That is an incredible story. Do you ever regret giving up the brush and exchanging it for a pen?
No, I paint. I do a little bit of plein air painting, and I give paintings for wedding presents. My wife loves Greece, and so I spent 2 years painting her a picture of Santorini, and she thought I would never finish it. It was like in the studio forever, but we have that in our living room. And I think when I retire, I think I'll go back and I'll do more painting, but partly because one of the things I had to ask myself, having gone through cancer, I wondered about, hey, John, you were around a lot of solvent, first as a printmaker and then as a painter, and I didn't always wear gloves, and what had I been breathing? I've always wondered if maybe careless use of paints and materials might have been a factor in cancer. And that gave me another reason to kind of be studio shy and spend my time at the word processor. And I don't really like acrylics. Everybody says, well, do watercolor and do acrylic.
Right.
I love oil.
Yeah.
So I'm going to maybe paint outdoors and watch my ventilation and wear gloves and be a painter again after retirement.
So are you well now? Are you in full remission?
Yes, 15 years of remission, and just maybe not to be dramatic about it, but I have to say it. I also went through a divorce at that time. And when I came through it, when I had remission, I was overjoyed to get my health back.
Yeah.
But I never expected to father children because of the type of cancer I'd had and the chemo I took. And I remarried 6 months after my recovery and have 2 little girls. I have an adopted daughter named Chloe, who came from my first marriage. And then my wife, Linda, and I have 2 daughters together. And the doctors had told me, don't expect to have children after your chemo. And
wow.
Boom, the kids just came. So I tell people it's like one of those Wile E. Coyote films where he goes off the cliff, but then there's a trampoline at the bottom. And I've had, a greater appreciation of life than ever before, having gone through that.
Yeah.
It matures you in a powerful way.
Yeah, I'm sure. What would you want to accomplish with your writing? Like if you could, I feel like I'm asking you this crazy pie in the sky question, but sort of given that, I'm really curious about what you would like to leave with your writing. If that's not too morbid of a question, that sounded really morbid.
No, I'll answer that. And I'm going to just slightly back up and tell you how my writing really took off. I mean, I had found I could write. I'd gotten an award. But 7 years ago, the Huffington Post opened its art section. And through the critic, Peter Frank, I got a blog to blog for the Huffington Post. So I got in just at this time when journalism was really changing.
Mm-hmm.
And what was so extraordinary about that opportunity is that although I did have a supervising editor, someone who was reading my blogs, I chose my own topics. I chose the length that I wanted to write. I chose the tone of what I wanted to write and the content. I had this tremendous freedom. So I had to ask myself, what do I really want to write?
Mm-hmm.
And, the answer was I wanted to tell stories about artists to help the public better understand their work. And the low-hanging fruit, I think that the things that really needed to be written were mainly blogs about and also interviews of representational painters.
Mm-hmm.
Because I knew some very good ones, and I just kept finding that they'd only gotten maybe small reviews or hadn't been written about. There was limited newspaper coverage of them and what they did because their work wasn't in vogue. And that really was the first thing I started out to do, was just to make sure that the artists I knew and respected got something out there in the blogosphere that could be found in Google search where people learned about them and learned about their art.
What are some of the more memorable conversations you've had with artists about their work or more memorable experiences from writing that blog?
Well, I'll tell you a wonderful early experience. One artist that I knew and I was dying to write about is a painter by the name of John Swihart, who is in Santa Monica. And I think a lot of people know his name because he gives these wonderful backyard potlucks with an artist speaker and brings people together. But I hadn't seen anything really strong written about him. I could find very little about him. So I interviewed him and wrote a kind of a profile that really started with how did he become an artist and what inspired him. And I found out that after the early death of his mother, kind of out of grief and out of needing to compose himself, he had discovered the artwork of a 19th century French painter by the name of Gérôme, was kind of an out-of-fashion painter. And he had met a great expert in the paintings of Gérôme and had traveled to France. Anyways, I was able to tell this whole story, kind of tell John's backstory and talk about what shaped him. And in a kind of an incredible set of coincidences, I published this, I think the day of or the day before he was going to be part of a panel at the Getty where they were giving a Gérôme show.
Oh, wow.
And through email or through social media or maybe a Google alert, somebody at the Getty found my blog, sent it to everybody on the Getty staff, and all these people were reading it. And John told me that as he got to the Getty that evening to give his lecture, people were congratulating him in the hallway and saying, "We love that article about you. Now we really know who you are. That was great." Somebody told him that they wished the article hadn't ended because they enjoyed it so much.
Oh, that's fantastic. That says a lot about your writing.
It really touched him. And it did, what I am most proud of, which is you tell someone's story. And it got his story out there in this really immediate and direct way.
That's so beautiful. I love that. I would love to hear your thoughts for artists on how they can tell their story through writing. What would you suggest for people listening?
Well, I'll say one thing. For a long time, and maybe this is before I wrote myself, I had been influenced by that idea of right brain and left brain.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all read Betty Edwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost had this idea of, you better be careful not to be too articulate because that's left brain. And if you're a painter, you should be pure and you should just paint and you should be off in this visual world. And now I've learned that that's, you don't actually become a worse painter if you start writing. And I would just encourage every artist, everyone has a website now. I just wouldn't hesitate to tell people in a very direct and very free way, tell your story. Give people background about some of the things that shaped you, about who your mentors were, about what you care about, and make sure that that's there for people to meet you when they first learn about you and first learn about their artwork or your artwork. And I also would encourage everybody to maybe have a friend or a family member or another artist trade interviews. I really enjoy, look who I'm talking to. I'm talking to Antrice Wood. You must get so much from interviewing people. I've gotten a great deal from interviewing people, and it gets you out of yourself,
Yes.
and socializes you. And I would say to every artist, call up or email an artist you respect, maybe someone you already know, or maybe someone you don't know, and ask to interview them. And you're going to have a wonderful experience. And then perhaps they'll interview you, or maybe that'll, it'll make that connection happen too.
That is fascinating. I love it. Yeah. To sort of answer your comment, I feel sometimes really selfish doing this podcast because I feel like I get way more out of it than what it's worth. But it is an amazing experience to be able to, especially right now in this time that we live, you can get into immediate contact with almost anyone. And to sort of add to what you said, when I first started this podcast, I was so scared to send people emails and say, will you please be on this podcast that I'm doing? And I was equally shocked when they said yes. And artists are, most artists are so giving and so gracious and love to talk to other artists who are genuinely interested in the work and who are also artists too. So I think, people will be really surprised at the response they get when they do that.
There's a story that I like. When I was a student, I went into a very small gallery, not an imposing gallery, and they had a beautiful show of things by Sam Francis. And I went to the counter and I said to the lady, because I was, an art student with my eyes popping out of my head, I said, how show by Sam Francis? She looked at me, she said, we called him. That was how they up in the phone book. And there's a lesson in that. Now in the age of email, ask. It never hurts to ask.
Yeah.
I have a class now. I teach a class in criticism and theory at the Laguna College of Art and Design. And what the class really is, I love the name criticism and theory. We should really call it going to all the museums we can.
Oh, I want to take that class.
Oh, teaching it is a dream. But I asked Bo Bartlett, would you Skype our class? And he said, yes. And it's a tiny class. There's 5 of us. And we got Bo Bartlett on Skype. And he Skyped us around his studio. And then he just came to the camera and spoke to each of my students for maybe 5 minutes. They had individual questions and they introduced themselves and they talked back and forth. And, when we shut the Skype off, we were silent. We kind of looked at each other. And then one of my students, he got this gleam in his eye and he said, I have to paint. And he ran out of the room. But it just came from, you ask someone, can we have a little bit of your time? And you get a yes. And these amazing things happen.
Yeah, it's so amazing. And I think I was kind of being a little bit facetious when I was, saying that it sounds like your life is like you kind of stumbled into the right place, but maybe it started as naivete or, just being young and you didn't know any better, but it doesn't seem like you've ever really been afraid to ask.
That's true. No, that's true. I haven't been afraid to ask. And
it's so powerful.
It's so powerful. But also, what is writing? Getting back to the theme of writing. Writing is social. And a problem I've had in my life, say that I'd met you or we had talked 15 years ago at an opening. Mm-hmm. I had a lot of complaints about it's such a long drive to Los Angeles. I miss my friends in Los Angeles. I want to go to the museum. I want to go to the galleries. And I have a job that's 2 hours away from LA or an hour and a half from San Diego. But the internet has erased that sense of you're just limited by your surroundings. I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
Emailing these artists that I'm interviewing for my blog. The social power of the internet is phenomenal. So if you have that attitude of, I'm going to drop someone a line, I'm going to email someone, I'm going to cold call someone, sky's the limit.
Yeah. Yeah. It is pretty incredible. And that whole, I might just be sensitive to it because of that experience with Morgan Flagg of just knowing that it would have been not only would it have been so easy, but he would have been delighted to answer all my questions. And I've seen this over and over again where people who just have that, I don't want to say ability, but they're just not afraid to ask, because really the worst that anyone can say is no. And what's wrong with no? It really doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't change your world. It's just a no. But most of the time, I think people say yes. And you're surprised at how, just being afraid of that one little, whatever question it is that people are afraid to ask. I'm sure people listening are realizing that there's something they want to ask somebody somewhere and they're kind of like hesitant to do it. But it doesn't, it's such a silly thing to be afraid of. And yet we stop ourselves from doing things that we really, really want to do just because maybe somebody will say no. And I do it too. So I'm not saying, it's something that's so simple. And so, just do it. But it kind of is that simple.
I'll share a secret with you. It's not really a secret. And this is something for any artists who are listening, that there is an artist you just would really like to be in touch with, right? Or for when you meet an artist you respect. I have been finding again and again that the most accomplished people are the nicest ones. Mm-hmm. And the most gracious ones. Case in point is Wayne Thiebaud. I got to interview Wayne Thiebaud and, got his phone number and called him at the appointed time. And I can't imagine speaking to someone who is more unaffected. He goes to his studio every day and has a terrific work ethic and is very open about how he works and his attitude about the whole thing. And it's breathtaking. But on the other hand, on the other side of the coin, we all go to openings. Sometimes we talk to people that are they're bragging and they're grandiose and they are very, very full of themselves, and you begin to realize that that's coming from insecurity. Mm-hmm. And so the person that you might be feeling a little bit intimidated by might be the person that is really ready to take an interest in you and be very, very gracious you might get a really pleasant surprise.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that.
Good. I'm glad you like it.
John, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for being on the podcast with me. I really appreciate it.
I'm a fan. The idea of hearing myself on your podcast, I'm really, really into it.
That's a huge honor because I really enjoy your work, and I'm very honored to have you on the show.
That's sweet of you. I'm blushing, but I don't have the video turned on. So
Thank you again to John Seed for taking the time to share your stories with us. What an incredible journey he's had. Everything from the Gagosian gallery to his current writing and teaching career. After reading his blog on the Huffington Post for so long, it was so nice to get to know you in person, John. You can find show notes for this episode, as always, at savvypainter.com. There are links to all of the artists that we mentioned during our conversation. Plus, there are some great photos of John throughout his career, including installing a Giacometti painting. When you're on savvypainter.com, you just click on the podcast tab, and there you can see the latest episodes. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, a few weeks ago, I started my little pledge drive to help keep Savvy Painter going. For the past 3 years, just about every week, I've been working hard to bring you tips and techniques to help you out in your studio. In-depth interviews with artists who are gracious enough to share their stories, and by sharing their stories, they show the rest of us that we are not alone. Each of us has a role to play in this community. So speaking of which, I want to take a moment of gratitude to thank some very special people in our community. Are you ready for this? Because this is great. A big shout out goes to Rhonda Doré, Anne-Marie Thomas, Eileen M. Cave, Rebecca Bellamy, Carol Mann, Mordenti Pottery, Deborah Nelson, Renee Ortiz, Agnieszka Grochulska. I hope I said your name right. I have a feeling I just totally mangled that. Julian Davis, Timothy Felice, Mary Little, MC Walter, Kathleen Speranza, Lynn Villamari, Whitney Heavy Art, Maria Herrera, and I'm sorry, I'm laughing, but it's because from the day I met my husband, he has always given me a hard time for not being able to roll my R's. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Melinda Kutzona, Andrew Ray, Carolyn Heck, P. Green Artwork, Ginny Gardner, Lynn Felton, Tom Breeden, Robin Olson, Lee Sadler, Cindy Yaklich, Jennifer Small, TVM Photo, Roxanne Zuniga, Arlo Raven, Barnett, Kate Hungerford, Leslie Wilson-Hewer, Susan Guevara, Tower Over, Florentina Muntino, MJ Blanchette, Robin Cloud, Andrea Cosmo, Chris Crotty, Carol Stewart, Right Design, Lauren Adams, Heidi Huck, Carol Lee Becks, Sarah Puckey, Srivani Nara, Deborah Mueller, John Seed, Jasmine Elliger, Laura Wooten, Deb Anderson, Susan Broderick, Elizabeth Quinn Bolduc, Jiyoung Kim Studio, Julie Ritter, Carolyn Lord, Gabrielle McDermott, Ijona Angeli, Adrian Cockcroft, Judith Chapman, Hannah Kaufman, David Thompson, Kenna Aoki, Jeanette Lideau, Ross Hogan, Fifth House Interiors, and Avery Endow. For all of you whose names that I completely mangled, my apologies, but nonetheless, I am so very grateful for your support of this podcast. It means so much to me to know that you are in my community. Thank you, thank you, thank you. One more thing I want to let you know. This year, you can expect a lot more workshops from Savvy Painter. If you are an artist who struggles with getting painting time in or feels like you're always busy but never really moving forward with your art, then my workshops just might interest you. Past workshops include Mindset Mastery, a 5-week online workshop to help you get past the roadblocks that keep you from painting. In it, we tackle the inner critic, fears of artists, and setting yourself up for a successful creative day. The workshop, How to Develop a Relationship with the Right Gallery, helps several artists find the right gallery and show their work. So if this is something that interests you, you can go to savvypainter.com/workshop and get on the email list. This is separate from the main list that tells you when a new episode comes out. This is just for the workshop, so you don't get quite as many emails, but when you do, there's always something really good happening. Sign up now and get a downloadable PDF with case studies that tell you exactly how 3 artists pushed through barriers that were getting in the way of their studio time. You can, for example, learn how Rhonda went from not wanting to call herself an artist to getting her very first solo show. Also, listen to an introverted artist describe how she built her confidence and then spoke in front of an audience of her peers. And you can discover the tools that Samantha used to take back her power after a decade of believing that she had no, I'm putting air quotes there, she had no talent. So again, go to savvypainter.com/workshop to reserve your place on the list. When you sign up, you get that downloadable case studies that I mentioned, but more importantly, you get exclusive invites to upcoming workshops. Most of the time when I launch a new program, it sells out before I ever announce it publicly. So reserve your spot now at savvypainter.com/workshop. Until next week, this is Antrice Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.